fellow mechaniacs and non-orc hobbyists, and welcome to another edition of Sork's Mech Shop. Today's episode is going to be a fulfillment of a request by one of my friends on the internet, Box. She is new to the hobby, and she decided that she's going to go on hard mode by starting off with Imperial Guard, or Adeptus Militarum for those of you new folks who are relatively new as well. And she really likes the aesthetic of the Korps of Krieg, and picked up a few boxes of their miniatures within the last couple months, and asked me to help her come up with a relatively lightweight, newbie-friendly, but still suitably grimdark kind of paint scheme for her models. And so this video is an attempt to do just that. The total paint job took less than an hour or so, but that included a little bit of experimentation on my part because, as I've told you all before, I don't necessarily do the first model with a solid plan in mind. I just sort of feel it out and go as I go. But I did try to keep a minimum number of paints, and I tried to go relatively heavy on use of like contrast and things like that, just to once again make it as easy as possible for her to replicate the effects. I also tried, in spite of the fact that it's supposed to be newbie friendly, or rather, in spite of the fact it's supposed to be for a newbie rather, I wanted to still include some variation of textures like I like to do on my own miniatures, but I tried to keep it relatively simple as well, just so it's easy enough for her to follow along. And also, ideally, this should be friendly for batch painting as well. And I think it will be. I think, if I remember right, the total painting time was something around an hour-ish, maybe an hour 10, but that includes the drying time. So if you end up doing like a squad at a time, then hopefully by the time the first one's done, by the time you get to the 10th one and you're ready to go back to the first one with the next coat of paint, it should be dry already by that point. And so you should be able to get a good assembly line going on any given squad. So without further ado, check out this Flamer Trooper that I decided to have a go at. Okay, starting from a black base coat, or correction, black primer, I'm going to do a bottom-up spray of burnt Sienna, I apologize, which is basically a red-brown. Now you could also skip this step by just priming the whole thing red-brown, but I didn't have a red-brown primer, so we're doing it this way. We're spraying it from the bottom up with a red-brown in order to basically get those shadows kind of warm, and this is going to make in my opinion, a more vibrant kind of end result compared to your traditional slap chop methods, because you're going to have a little bit of color underneath it instead of just being pure desaturated black and pure desaturated grays and whites for your dry brushing and whatnot. Next step here is going to be doing the traditional zenithal with a white ink, in this case titanium white, which is going to give me sort of an all-over gray coming down from the top. One thing to remember here, if you don't have an airbrush, is that you can do the exact same effect both on the bottom and on the top using a regular brush. You can do sponging as well if you prefer a little bit of texture. All these things work well. In this case, I'm doing an extra dry brush with a pure titanium white again, just to get those highest highlights and sharpest edges. You might ask why I'm using that sponge there. It's just a regular old kitchen sponge. I put a little bit of water on it, and the reason I'm doing that is because it helps with keeping the chalkiness out of the white. What you'll do is start the dry brushing, tap it against the sponge a little bit to get a little bit of water, add a little bit extra moisture back into the brush, and then go in there again. Next step here, I'm using a Ochre Clay from Army Painter, and just getting the lightest of the browns that I'm going in there. This is going to be for the mask and the boots basically, because I want those to be a little bit different from the rest, especially the mask. And using the speed paint again is going to help fill in the darkest parts with the more of the darker part of the color, and the highest parts with the lighter part of the color. Next is going to be most of the gray bits are going to be done with Gravelord Grey out of Army Painter again. And I added a little bit of contrast medium because I wanted it to be a thinner coat first, just to allow it to look a little bit more gray overall, and not so much well, bottom line is I thought that the Gravelord Grey out of the bottle was a little bit too dark, is what it really comes down to. So I wanted to have more of the white showing through, so I thinned it out before applying it to the greatcoat and the sleeves of the greatcoat. That's really the main areas that I'm doing with this. What I found as I was doing this, though, was that, and this was on me, and again, it goes back to the experimental thing, is that I hadn't waited long enough for the burnt sienna to dry, and so it wound up reactivating it a little bit, and so I wound up with a little bit more of a brownish gray, which I'll come back and fix later. I go through here again with a little bit of, this is kind of it was sort of a mid-brown, and then following up with one of my favorite metal colors. This is Duralumin from Vallejo metal color, and I'm just going through and getting all of the metals with that. I didn't talk too much about the brown because I actually didn't end up using it. I poured it and then didn't use it. I decided to go through the metal first and go around from that. So what I'm doing here is I'm essentially getting all the metal, all the things that are going to be metal with the Duralumin first, and then I'm going to change their tones later on with some more contrast. And doing that is going to make it look like it's been either painted over or enameled over or what have you. And so I'm getting the shoulder pads, the fuel tanks, the helmet, all those sorts of things with the Duralumin. Just for future reference, the leather that I ended up using, or the brown I put in that pot was Hardened Leather from Speedpaint also, but like I said, I ended up not really using it very much. The places I did end up using it was just on the pants underneath the greatcoat, but it ended up not being very easy to see in the painting or in the video here. Next thing I'm doing here is I'm taking a little bit of pale sand from Painter as well, and I'm trying to fix the problems I had before, where I told you I wound up with a little bit too much brown in my greatcoat. And so I'm taking just a little bit of paint on the brush and I'm making it very scratchy looking. And what this is doing, I'm making kind of a X pattern as I go all over the place, because I want the greatcoat to look like it's a really coarse fabric. And so I'm making it brighter than I want it to be using this pale sand, because I'm going to eventually come back over it again with another coat of the Gravelord Grey to bring it back down to gray again. So the nice thing about using the contrasts is that you can kind of keep doing them over and over again. And then I'm doing the same thing on the mask and on the boots, because I'm trying to create a sort of a depth with the contrast. So here again, going with a thinner mix of Gravelord Grey plus the contrast medium, and using my thumb to sort of test the transparency of it. Basically, you want to be able to see through it, because when you go over the cloak with it, you want to be able to see those scratchy looking colors from the pale sand that I put on it. And again, I like that look because it gives you some texture contrast between the different parts of the materials that you have on your on your miniature. The cloth should look like cloth, the metal should look like metal, and the leather should look like leather is what it really comes down to for me. So going all around with the Gravelord Grey again. And then once again I'm mixing in some more of that Ochre Clay and contrast medium to get the ochre parts done again, the mask and the boots. Another layer of contrast over that lightened pale sand that I did again. And then here's that leather color that I'm going in again, as I said, onto the pants that are sort of underneath the greatcoat. And then I took some of the contrast black Templar and again thinned it a bit with some contrast, and now I'm going over all the parts that are either metal or that I want to have black. So that's going to be the stock of the flamethrower as well as all the metal bits. And We're going to come back and weather those later, but for now, we want them all just a nice even black. And so we're doing that everywhere with the contrast black Templar. Part of the trick with using the contrast paints is to make sure you have enough on your paintbrush that it's going to flow into the crevices, but not so much that it just floods the entire area. So you want to watch out for that as you're working with it. And again, just kind of working all the way around the model, getting everything that I want to have black, including the hose, the weapon. Eventually I'll get to the helmet here in a second. Yep, there we go. As I'm looking at it, I'm thinking that the cloak is still a little bit too, I don't know, rough looking maybe, splotchy. It's not quite as textured as I want it to be, a little too splotchy. So what I'm doing next is I'm going to create like a light gray glaze using a mix of the Gravelord Grey and the pale sand. And so what a glaze is essentially, it's not a contrast, it's a very, very thin paint that's very translucent. And what I'm doing here is essentially fixing the highlights on that cloak, or excuse me, greatcoat, so that it reads more as gray. Whereas before I felt like it was reading just too mottled. So by doing this, it's going to come off as actually being more of a uniform gray with the texture and with the shadows in place. And so I'm really just focusing here on the areas that are more highlight areas, so that the higher raised portions is going to be catching the sun, and then the edges, of course, as well. And again, this is just to sort of make sure you fix the color. One thing to remember is that the eye is going to read color based on the predominant color, but also the highest highlight of the color, if that makes sense. Unless you have very, very thin highlights, it's going to read this as being more gray now, because I've got the highlights in a fairly broad pattern as a more mid-tone gray, whereas like I said before, it just kind of looked mottled and not very uniform. Now you could probably skip this step potentially if you had not done what I did, which is letting that if I'd let the burnt sienna actually finish itself off all the way. Next, what I'm doing here is I'm taking some more silver. In this case, I used a Pro Acryl silver. You could still use the Duralumin if you don't want to buy another paint. To take, and this is an older brush that I'm using that's got kind of a splayed tip to it. It's kind of a damaged tip, and I'm just sort of stippling across it with that paint so that it's leaving just little nicks and scratches and areas of thinner looking enamel of the paint on the paint, and then I'll come back through again with an actual brush that's got a tip and dot in on the buttons, and then also dot in kind of a stabbing motion along the edges of some of the armor plates where I think that the wear and tear would be the most severe for any given piece of metal. So like where it would bang up against stuff, where it might have chips from battle damage, that sort of thing. And here's where I'm doing that on the shoulder pads. And so that's going to really sell the edges. And the other reason I did it this way is because as I was looking at the model, and again we're being experimental, right? So as I was looking at the model, what I was noticing was that the shoulder pads kind of ran into, they just sort of didn't have a visual separation from the greatcloak as much as I wanted them to. So I really wanted to highlight that edge definition, and so I did that by adding some extra metallic battle damage to the edges of them, and that really made them stand out separately from the greatcloak. That bit of white I added in was just to undercoat the eye lenses, and then now I'm going to take some resplendent red, again from Army Painter, and just do some very quick eye lenses on the gas mask. And then I'll come back, I'll add a little bit of yellow. This is going to be a very light yellow called Space Dust, I believe it is, from Army Painter. And I'll just mix it in to make kind of an orange, a light orange, to give just a little touch of highlight, followed by ever so slight bit of white on the edges, really on the corner, to show the reflection. And then I'm just kind of going all over to check it out and see what's what. Next we go to the base. I'm taking Sterling mud as technical paint from GW. I'm using a little metal spatula here. You could just as easily use like a coffee stirrer that you grab from Starbucks or whatever as you buy a coffee from them. Obviously, don't just walk in and grab coffee stirrers. But use this to press the mud into the base. And as you're doing that, make sure you get it all the way up against the boots. Make sure you get it on the boots, because the boots have to be part of the environment too, right? The guy's stepping in mud and he's getting it all over his clothing. And one of the things you want to do with the technical paints, they're thicker, and they hold their shape once they dry. So I'm actually piling the mud up, and I'm sculpting a little bit with that brush to make divots and rises, right? So mud's not an even flat surface, divots and rises. Once it's dry, I'm taking a little bit of, I can't remember the name of it, it's a mocha something from Army Painter, and mocha skin maybe, and I'm using that to dry brush the highest parts of the mud, and some of which I got on the actual greatcoat on purpose, and so I'm highlighting that as well to show where maybe it's starting to dry a little bit and flake. And then once that's on, I then go back through, dry brushing a little bit more in there. But then after that, I'm going to go in and darken the deepest parts, the crevices, if you will, the valleys of the area with some Army Painter Strong Tone. And the reason I'm using that there is to really emphasize the difference between the deepest parts and the highest parts. And I want to make the deepest parts look like they're still wet and soggy. And then the highest parts, I want to make sure have that kind of yellowy, ochre look. So I actually skipped a step here. Before I added the Strong Tone, I went through and added a thin bit of ochre clay as well, like the boots have, just to sort of give that visual appeal to it. And then the last thing I'm doing here, once I've let the Strong Tone dry, is I'm coming through with a gloss varnish and I'm pooling it up on there. Not just putting a thin coat, but I'm actually creating pools of varnish on there, of gloss varnish, in order to make those darker parts look like they're actually puddles of water. And here is the final product. Pretty monochrome looking, but I think it meets the goal that Box asked me to do for it. It's very World War I, very drab, very grimdark, and looks like it's immersed in its environment. And I really hope she likes it.